In medieval Europe, between 1100 and 1500, animals could be summoned before courts, assigned legal counsel, sentenced, and sometimes executed. Among the most unsettling and revealing were trials involving cats. Not because cats were common criminals, but because they became symbols of heresy, of witchcraft, of disorder, of female autonomy, of something that moved at night and did not obey. This journey explores how medieval societies constructed meaning through ritual punishment, how fear hardened into law, and why putting a cat on trial could feel not absurd, but necessary. Because in a world governed by God, hierarchy, and spectacle, even a cat could threaten the cosmic order. And power doesn't whisper, it performs. The cat is inside a wooden cage. It isn't hissing, it isn't fighting. It's simply staring, unblinking, at the people who have come to judge it. You are in a medieval courtroom in France, and the defendant is a cat. It's the year 1457. You're standing in a stone hall in a provincial town in eastern France. The air smells faintly of damp wool and candle wax. Light filters through narrow windows, cutting the dust into visible beams. The magistrate sits elevated on a wooden platform. His robe is dark, trimmed in fur. A clerk dips his quill into ink. The crowd presses close. Shoemakers, bakers, children lifted onto shoulders. At the center of the room, a crate. Inside it, a cat. No chains, just wood slats. The accusation, records suggest in similar cases from the 14th and 15th centuries, might involve killing livestock, harming an infant, or being linked to maleficium, harmful magic. Exact details vary. Some cases are well documented. Others survive only as fragments in municipal archives. But here's what we know for certain. Medieval courts in parts of France and neighboring regions did prosecute animals, pigs, rats, horses, and sometimes cats. Now pause. Not folklore, not fables. Legal procedure. Charges, sentences, executions. And here's what most people miss. This was not madness. It was structure. If you're new here, consider subscribing. This channel is for long-form journeys into the strange corners of history, the places where belief, power, and psychology intersect. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most unsettling of them all. Before we go further, ask yourself something. If a society truly believes that the universe is morally ordered, what happens when something disrupts it? To understand a cat on trial, we have to leave modern logic behind. Between 1100 and 1500, much of Europe operated within a deeply theological framework. Law was not separate from God. Justice mirrored divine order. In medieval France, legal systems blended Roman law, local customary law, and canon law, the law of the church. Everything had a place in the great chain of being. God, angels, humans, animals, plants, stones. Hierarchy was not metaphor. It was reality. So, when something acted against its nature, it wasn't just inconvenient. It was destabilizing. And here's where it gets complicated. Animals were considered part of God's creation. They did not possess rational souls like humans, but they could still act as instruments of disorder. A pig that killed a child, a swarm of locusts that destroyed crops, a bull that gored a farmer. If harm occurred, someone or something had to answer. Because justice was not only about punishment, it was about restoring balance. And balance had to be visible. Power doesn't whisper, it performs. So the court assembled. Now imagine the alternative. If a town simply shrugged at a violent act by an animal, what message would that send? that chaos is acceptable, that divine order can be mocked, that the magistrate is powerless, that the church cannot contain evil. In a world where famine, plague, and war were constant threats, symbolic control mattered. More than comfort, more than efficiency, more than what we would call reason. And here's the unsettling part. Sometimes these trials followed meticulous legal process. In documented animal trials from the 14th and 15th centuries in France and Switzerland, animals were assigned legal representation. In one famous 1522 case in Autumn, slightly outside our core range but illustrative, rats were provided a defense lawyer who argued they failed to appear in court because of danger from cats. Yes, a lawyer argued procedural fairness for rats, which tells us something profound. This wasn't improvisation, it was institutional. Think of it like a corporate PR crisis. When a major brand faces scandal, executives don't just fix the internal issue quietly. They hold press conferences, they publish statements, they fire someone publicly, not always because it solves the root problem, but because perception of control must be restored. A medieval animal trial functioned similarly. It declared, the system sees, the system judges, the system acts. Records of animal trials survive in legal archives from regions of France, particularly in Burgundy and the Savoy area. Between the 13th and 16th centuries, multiple documented cases exist involving pigs executed for killing children. In 1386, in Falaise, Normandy, a sow was publicly executed after attacking a child. The event was recorded in municipal documentation. Cats appear less frequently in surviving records, but they surface in festival accounts, municipal prohibitions, and later chroniclers describing ritual burnings during midsummer celebrations in parts of France. Historians debate how widespread these were. Some argue exaggeration by later writers. Others cite scattered civic records suggesting occasional occurrences. So we proceed carefully, because separating myth from documentation is part of the story. And that's when everything shifts. If some of these stories were exaggerated later, why were they believable at all? A cat in a courtroom, a magistrate performing justice, a crowd witnessing order restored. This wasn't random cruelty. It was ritualized reassurance, a system acting out stability in a fragile world. But to understand why a cat could become dangerous enough to prosecute, we have to step back into the medieval imagination, into a world where night belonged to uncertainty, where animals crossed boundaries, and where symbolism could condemn as surely as law. Because before cats entered the courtroom, they entered the shadows. A bell tolls before sunrise. Mist hangs low over wooden rooftops. And somewhere in the half-light, a cat slips between shadows as if it belongs to both worlds. It's the year 1230. You're standing in a market square in northern France. The stones beneath your boots are slick from morning dew. The air smells of wood smoke and damp straw. Vendors are setting up stalls, turnips, onions, salted fish. A priest walks past, his breath visible in the cold air. A butcher sharpens his blade against a whetstone. Children chase each other between carts. Above you rises a cathedral still under construction, scaffolding clinging to stone like ribs around a spine. B-roll suggestion. Cathedral vault ceiling, illuminated manuscript of daily life, narrow medieval alley. Everything around you feels temporary, and yet everyone here believes in permanence. Not of buildings, not of kingdoms, but of order. The universe is structured, designed, layered. You wake with the sun because God designed the sun to rise. You till soil because humans were placed above animals in the hierarchy of creation. You obey your Lord because authority flows downward from heaven itself. And if that sounds rigid, it was. But it was also comforting, because in a world of famine cycles, infant mortality, and sporadic war, certainty was survival. Here's what most people miss. Medieval Europeans did not see randomness the way we do. They saw meaning. Between 1100 and 1500, Western Europe, particularly regions that would become modern France, operated within a deeply Christian cosmology shaped by scholastic theology and inherited Roman legal ideas. The concept, often referred to by modern historians as the great chain of being, structured reality vertically. God at the summit. Angelic beings, humanity, animals, plants, minerals. Every level had purpose. Every level had boundaries. And crossing boundaries was dangerous. Cats uniquely seemed to blur them. They were domesticated, but not obedient like dogs. They lived in homes, but hunted independently. They moved at night, when humans were meant to sleep. They stared without obvious emotion. And in a culture obsessed with visible hierarchy, ambiguity created anxiety. And here's where it gets complicated. Medieval theology held that animals lacked rational souls. They were not morally accountable in the same way humans were. But they were not morally irrelevant. Animals could be instruments of God or instruments of the devil. That distinction mattered, because if harm occurred, it was never simply biological. It was symbolic. Now imagine a chicken coop raided overnight, or a baby found injured, or crops mysteriously failing. In a world without modern forensic science, explanations filled the gaps. Not foolish explanations, coherent ones. If the cosmos is ordered, then disorder must have intention. And if intention exists, responsibility must follow. This is why legal proceedings against animals did not appear irrational to medieval townspeople. They were acts of restoration, ceremonial rebalancing. And here's the unsettling part. The court was not just solving a problem, it was performing reassurance. Power doesn't whisper, it performs. Think about how we react today when something feels out of control. A viral scandal spreads online. A company issues statements. A government announces investigations. We hold hearings, even when outcomes are predictable. Why? Because procedure itself calms anxiety. It signals that chaos is being contained. Medieval courts did the same thing, but instead of trending hashtags, they had church bells and public squares. By the 13th century, France was consolidating legal authority under Capetian monarchs like Louis IX, who strengthened royal courts and emphasized moral governance. Canon law, developed through church councils and legal compilations such as Gratian's Decretum in the 12th century, shaped thinking about sin, responsibility, and divine order. Meanwhile, customary local courts handled daily disputes, property conflicts, violence, theft. It was within these local systems that animal prosecutions most often occurred. Municipal records from regions including Burgundy and Savoy preserved documentation of animal trials from the 14th and 15th centuries. The structure is consistent. Complaint filed, animal detained, court convened, sentence delivered, because the point wasn't the animal's consciousness, it was the community's coherence. Historians debate how common these trials truly were. Some argue surviving records exaggerate frequency. Others point to scattered archives suggesting they were unusual but not unheard of. What matters is this: they made sense within the logic of the time. A world built on hierarchy, a cosmos layered with meaning, a society where disorder demanded response. Cats, creatures of boundary and shadow, didn't just live in this world. They unsettled it. And when anxiety rises, symbolism sharpens, because cats were not just animals in medieval Europe. They were symbols of independence, of secrecy, of the night. And as heresy fears intensified in the 13th century, those symbols darkened. In the next chapter, we step inside the courtroom itself, not to laugh, but to watch how law transforms anxiety into ritual. The clerk clears his throat. The charge is read aloud. The accused does not speak, but the court proceeds anyway. It's 1386. You're standing in the town of Falaise in Normandy. SFX. Distant murmuring crowd. A wooden cartwheel creaking. The morning is overcast. Damp air presses against your skin. Townspeople gather in the square, some solemn, some curious, some whispering behind rough spun sleeves. In front of you stands a wooden scaffold. Nearby, a sow, large, restrained. The accusation, the killing of a child. Municipal records confirm this event. The sow was tried, convicted, and publicly executed. Payment records survive detailing the cost of gloves for the executioner and even clothing placed on the animal to mimic human punishment ritual. It feels surreal. But to the people here, it feels necessary. Now shift perspective. You're not here for spectacle. You're here because the system must respond. And here's what most people miss. This is not chaos, pretending to be law. This is law expanding to contain chaos. Between the 13th and 15th centuries, documented animal trials appear across parts of France, Switzerland, and northern Italy. The legal framework differed depending on jurisdiction. Secular courts prosecuted domestic animals for crimes against people. Ecclesiastical courts sometimes addressed infestations, rats, insects, through excommunication or ritual censure. Yes, insects could be summoned. In 15th century cases from Switzerland and eastern France, records show beetles and rats formally ordered to vacate fields under threat of ecclesiastical sanction. Historians debate how literally such proceedings were enforced, but the documentation of summonses and procedural language survives. And here's where it gets complicated. The animal was not assumed to have human rationality, but harm had occurred. Under medieval legal reasoning, heavily influenced by revived Roman law traditions taught in universities, like Bologna, damage demanded liability. If a human caused death, they faced trial. If an animal caused death, the owner could sometimes be fined. But in many cases, the animal itself was prosecuted and executed. Because execution was not merely punitive, it was purgative. It removed contamination from the moral body of the town. And this is the unsettling part. Some animals were assigned legal counsel. In 1522, in autumn, rats were provided a defense advocate who argued procedural unfairness when they failed to appear. Though slightly outside our 1,100 to 1,500 frame, the case reflects earlier traditions already in place. The argument: the rats could not safely travel due to predatory cats along the route. The court entertained the claim, not as satire, as procedure, which tells us something critical. The ritual mattered more than the outcome. Now imagine standing in that square. If no trial occurred, If the sow was simply killed quietly, what would linger? Whispers, doubt, fear that the magistrate ignored divine imbalance. The trial transformed private grief into public order. Power doesn't whisper, it performs, and performance stabilizes authority. But here's where history shifts. Pigs and livestock were prosecuted because they caused tangible harm. Cats were different. Cats carried something less measurable. Symbolism. Think of modern legal theatrics, high-profile court cases broadcast live, political hearings streamed across platforms. Sometimes the outcome is predictable, but the process reassures audiences that accountability exists. Medieval trials functioned similarly. They were civic theatre, not fake, not frivolous, structured, intentional, reassuring. The difference? Instead of television cameras, there were church bells and scaffolds. The 1386 Falaise case remains one of the best documented examples of an animal execution in medieval France. Financial records detail payment to the executioner, the purchase of gloves, the cost of maintaining the animal in custody. Such specificity undermines the idea that these were invented legends. Other cases in the 14th and 15th centuries appear in municipal archives from Burgundy and Savoy. Though documentation varies in completeness, historians caution that surviving records are fragmentary. We cannot assume trials were everyday occurrences, but neither were they isolated myths. They sit in the archival grey zone, rare but real. And as legal systems matured in medieval France, especially under centralized royal authority, procedure became increasingly standardized, which makes one question unavoidable. If pigs could be prosecuted for physical harm, what happens when fear itself becomes the crime? Animals entered the courtroom not because they understood guilt, but because communities needed closure. Trials restored balance. Executions symbolized purification. Procedure created confidence. And now we approach the creature that complicated everything. Because unlike pigs, cats did not simply bite. They symbolized. By the 13th century, whispers were growing about heresy, about secret rituals, about creatures that moved at night. And in those whispers, cats began to change, not in biology, in meaning. Next, we step into that transformation. A pair of eyes catches candlelight, not in the street, not in the forest, inside the house. And they do not blink. It's 1325. You're inside a timber-framed home in a small town in central France. The floor is packed earth. A fire crackles low in the hearth. The air smells of ash, cabbage stew, and wool drying near the flames. A child sleeps near the wall. A woman mends clothing. And in the corner, curled near a basket of grain, a cat. You hear scratching in the rafters. Mice. The cat rises without being told, moves silently, efficiently, useful, necessary. You feel relief. Grain means survival. Mice mean loss. The cat is protection. But now notice something else. When the room grows darker and the fire dims, the cat's eyes reflect the embers like twin lanterns. It vanishes into shadow and returns without warning. It watches without expression. And here's what most people miss. Medieval Europeans did not fear cats because they were useless. They feared them because they were useful and independent. Cats lived in houses, but they did not submit. They hunted on their own terms. They slipped between domestic space and wilderness. They moved freely at night, the realm of uncertainty. In a culture that valued hierarchy and visible obedience, that ambiguity felt unstable. Cats were present in medieval Europe well before our period. They had arrived centuries earlier through trade routes and Roman expansion. By 1100, they were common in towns, monasteries, and rural farms. Monastic manuscripts from the 12th and 13th centuries even include marginal illustrations of cats chasing mice. B-roll suggestion: illuminated manuscript margins with animals, monastic scriptorium. So this is important. Cats were not universally hated. They were tolerated, often appreciated. But symbolism evolves. By the 13th century, Europe was experiencing religious turbulence. Heresy movements such as the Cathars in southern France triggered church responses that intensified concern about hidden belief systems. And here's where it gets complicated. Cats began appearing in accusations tied to secret gatherings. One particularly influential document was issued in 1233 by Pope Gregory IX. The papal bull Vox in Rama described alleged heretical rites in Germany involving the appearance of a black cat in ritual settings. Historians debate how widespread these practices truly were. Many argue the descriptions were polemical exaggerations designed to demonize heretical groups. But the imagery stuck. A black cat, a secret ritual, darkness, reversal. Whether factual or fabricated, the narrative entered cultural imagination, and once symbolism attaches, it spreads. Now picture a town already anxious about crop failures, or rumors of heresy, or whispers of witchcraft, still forming, not yet systematized as in later centuries, but present in suspicion. You see a cat crossing a path at dusk. Its movement is silent, its gaze unreadable. If something goes wrong the next day, if milk spoils, if illness strikes, the cat becomes more than an animal. It becomes a vessel for explanation. And here's the unsettling part. The fear wasn't random superstition. It was narrative reinforcement. The church emphasized visible moral order. Secular courts emphasized public accountability. Cats represented ambiguity, and ambiguity, in times of stress, becomes threatening. Power doesn't whisper, it performs, and sometimes it performs by identifying a symbol. Think about how certain symbols shift meaning today. A logo once associated with innovation becomes linked to scandal. A public figure once admired becomes reinterpreted overnight through viral narratives. The object itself hasn't changed, but its symbolic weight has. Cats in medieval Europe experienced something similar. Their biology stayed constant, their meaning transformed. The 1233 papal bull Vox in Rama is often cited in discussions about medieval associations between cats and heresy. While its immediate geographic focus was Germany, its imagery circulated through ecclesiastical networks. By the 14th century, scattered accounts in parts of France describe cats being killed during certain festival rituals, especially around midsummer celebrations. The scale is debated. Some historians argue later chroniclers exaggerated these events to portray the Middle Ages as cruel. Others cite municipal references suggesting occasional ritual burnings occurred in specific towns. What we can say with confidence: cats were not universally persecuted, but they were symbolically vulnerable, especially black cats, especially at night, especially when fear was already present. Cats were protectors of grain, companions in homes, common, ordinary creatures. But symbolism shifted. Heresy fears intensified. Darkness gained narrative meaning. And the cat, moving between worlds, absorbed suspicion. Because once symbolism attaches to fear, law begins to follow, and in the next chapter, we enter the courtroom again. But this time, the charge isn't livestock damage. It's something far less tangible. Influence, association, whispers. A candle is extinguished. The room goes dark. In the silence, someone swears they saw a shape move, and someone else whispers, "It was the cat." It's 12:55. You're in a stone-walled chamber lit by a single oil lamp in southern France. The air smells of smoke and damp mortar. Outside, the town is quiet, but not peaceful. Rumors circulate of secret meetings in barns, of alternative teachings, of heresy, spreading like a hidden infection. Across the table sits a local cleric. His fingers rest on parchment. He is tired. He is serious. He believes the stakes are eternal. He asks questions, not about cats directly, but about gatherings, about rituals, about strange presences in the night. You shift in your seat. You mention that a neighbor keeps to herself, that she has a cat, that it comes and goes after sunset. The cleric writes something down, and here's what most people miss. The fear wasn't about fur and claws. It was about infiltration, about the idea that evil doesn't arrive as a dragon. It arrives quietly, in familiar shapes. The 13th century in France was marked by profound religious tension. The Cathar movement in southern France challenged church authority with alternative theological teachings. The church responded forcefully, most notably with the Albigensian Crusade beginning in 1209. Heresy was not viewed as mere disagreement. It was spiritual, treason. And here's where it gets complicated. As church authorities expanded investigative procedures, especially under papal direction, suspicion of secret rites intensified. The imagery described in Vox in Rama, issued in 1233 under Pope Gregory IX, portrayed alleged heretical ceremonies involving a black cat appearing as a diabolical figure. Modern historians widely agree these descriptions were likely exaggerated or polemical, designed to shock and mobilize opposition against heretical groups, but accuracy was almost secondary. Imagery persuades. Imagery lingers. Imagery shapes fear. And once a black cat becomes associated, even rhetorically, with inverted ritual, secrecy, and darkness, the association is difficult to undo. Now imagine living in a town where sermons warn of hidden corruption, where loyalty to orthodoxy is publicly affirmed, where deviation risks exile or worse. If a woman lives alone, if she keeps unusual hours, if a black cat is seen near her door, is the animal guilty, or is it symbolic evidence? And this is where history shifts. The cat becomes what historians later call a familiar figure, not yet fully developed into the witchcraft trials of the 16th and 17th centuries, but gestating in cultural imagination, an animal companion, a conduit, a silent witness to suspected wrongdoing. The anxiety is subtle, but it grows. Power doesn't whisper, it performs, and performance requires a visible adversary. Consider how, in times of political polarization today, certain symbols become shorthand for ideological threat. A hat, a flag, a logo. They are ordinary objects, but in tense environments, they transform into signals of allegiance or danger. Cats in medieval France, especially black cats, began to function similarly. They became visual cues within a charged narrative, not because of what they did, but because of what they represented. The Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229, reshaped southern France, weakening regional autonomy and reinforcing church authority. In 1233, the papacy formalized procedures that expanded inquisitorial methods for investigating heresy. While the formal medieval Inquisition varied regionally and evolved over time, it institutionalized suspicion toward hidden belief systems. Direct records of cats being prosecuted explicitly for heresy are scarce and debated. Historians caution against overstatement. Much of the evidence linking cats to diabolical imagery comes from polemical texts and later chroniclers, but we do have documentation of festival rituals in parts of France, especially in later centuries, where cats were burned during midsummer celebrations. The origins of those rituals remain contested. What matters for this moment in the 13th century is the shift in imagination. The cat becomes morally charged, not universally condemned, but symbolically vulnerable. Heresy fears intensify. Secret rituals dominate sermons. A papal document introduces striking imagery. The black cat becomes a narrative device. Suspicion begins to attach, not everywhere, not always, but enough. And when symbolism meets law, something changes. Because fear alone does not create trials. Fear must be structured, codified, performed. In the next chapter, we watch suspicion harden into ritual spectacle, not in secret chambers, but in public squares. The bonfire is taller than a house. Children cheer, musicians play, and in a wicker cage suspended above the flames, something moves. It's Midsummer's Eve. The year is 1471. You're standing in a crowded square in Paris. The air is warm, thick with smoke and anticipation. Resinous wood crackles in a towering pyre stacked carefully in the center of the square. SFX, crackling fire, distant drumbeat, crowd murmuring. Vendors sell wine. Someone laughs. A priest stands nearby. Officials in municipal colors observe from a raised platform. Above the fire hangs a basket. Inside it, cats. Records from later centuries describe such spectacles during St. John's Eve celebrations in parts of France, including Paris and Metz. Historians debate how common or consistent these events were in the 14th and 15th centuries. Some accounts come from chroniclers writing later, sometimes with a moralizing tone. Others cite municipal references that suggest such rituals did occur at times. We move carefully here, but imagine the scene. The fire is lit. Heat presses against your face. The crowd surges forward, not in cruelty alone, but in ritual. This is a festival, a celebration of light overcoming darkness, the summer solstice, Christianized into St. John's Eve. And here's what most people miss. This is not random violence. It is symbolic purification. Fire festivals long predate Christianity in Europe. Seasonal bonfires mark transitions, solstices, harvest cycles, renewal. By the medieval period, many of these traditions were absorbed into Christian calendars. St. John's Eve, celebrated on June 23rd, became one such moment. Bonfires symbolize cleansing, protection, community unity. And here's where it gets complicated. If cats had, by this period, absorbed associations with darkness, secrecy, and possible diabolical imagery, then placing them within a fire ritual amplified meaning. The flames did not merely burn, they purified. They reaffirmed that light triumphs, that order reasserts itself, that the town stands aligned with heaven. Power doesn't whisper, it performs. And few performances are more dramatic than fire against night. But here's the unsettling part. festivals blur boundaries. They permit behavior normally restricted. Crowds move differently in firelight. Music quickens pulse. Children witness spectacle. In moments like these, the line between ritual and cruelty narrows. And that's when everything changes. Because spectacle does not only express belief, it strengthens it. The more public the act, the more collective the affirmation. The more collective the affirmation, the more dissent feels impossible. And now consider something deeper. If a town burns cats publicly, what message travels quietly through its social fabric? That ambiguity will not be tolerated, that symbols of darkness will be destroyed, that authority is vigilant. Think about modern public rituals of outrage. A celebrity is cancelled. A product is publicly destroyed on social media. A public figure is shamed before millions. These acts are not always about the object itself. They are about signaling alignment. They are about demonstrating moral clarity to a crowd. Medieval fire festivals operated within a similar emotional logic. The crowd affirms itself by watching something symbolic disappear in flame. Accounts of cats being burned during St. John's Eve in Paris appear in later chroniclers' descriptions, particularly referencing the Place de Grève, modern Place de l'Hôtel de Ville. Some historians caution that detailed descriptions come from sources centuries later and may exaggerate scale or frequency. Municipal records from Metz and other towns reference festival expenditures involving animals, though interpretation varies. What we can say responsibly: public fire rituals were real. Symbolic use of animals in some of those rituals appears in historical references. The extent and consistency remain debated, but the cultural logic aligns with broader medieval symbolic practice. And remember, by the late 15th century, Europe was entering an era of intensified witchcraft anxiety, though the major witch hunts would peak later. The symbolic groundwork was already forming. A bonfire under summer stars, a crowd unified in spectacle, cats transformed into symbols of darkness, flames cast as purification, belief enacted publicly. Because ritual does not whisper, it declares. But festivals are only part of the story, because not all accusations happen under open sky. Some happen in kitchens, in alleys, in whispers between neighbors, and often they circle back to women. A widow closes her door at dusk. Inside, a single candle burns. Outside, someone mutters, "She keeps strange company." It's 1394. You're standing at the edge of a narrow street in a provincial French town. Rain from earlier in the day clings to the stones. The air smells of wet straw and chimney smoke. A woman walks alone ahead of you. She carries a basket of herbs gathered from the outskirts of town. Her clothes are simple, patched. She does not hurry. Behind her, a cat follows, not closely, but near enough. A boy notices. He nudges his friend. They whisper. The woman is a widow. Her husband died years ago. She earns small coins helping with childbirth and preparing remedies for coughs and fevers. She lives at the edge of town. She owns no livestock. She answers to no husband. In a society structured by visible hierarchy, she exists in a grey space. And here's what most people miss. The anxiety was rarely about cats alone. It was about independence, about individuals, especially women, who existed slightly outside expected structures. Between 1100 and 1500, medieval France was legally and socially patriarchal. Most women lived under the authority of fathers, husbands, or male relatives. Widows had more autonomy. but autonomy could invite suspicion. Women who practiced healing arts, midwifery, or herbal knowledge operated in liminal zones. Their skills were practical and often valued, but in moments of crisis, failed births, unexplained illness, they could become convenient targets. And here's where it gets complicated. The full-scale witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries had not yet reached their peak in our time frame, but the intellectual groundwork, linking women, secrecy, and demonic influence, was forming. Cats, already symbolically charged, became natural companions in that narrative, not because every woman accused had a cat, but because the pairing made symbolic sense. A solitary woman, a creature of the night, both independent, both difficult to control. Power doesn't whisper, it performs, and when authority feels threatened, it often performs through containment. Now imagine a failed harvest, or a stillborn child, or milk that curdles unexpectedly. You search for explanation. You look for proximity. Who was nearby? Who is already whispered about? Who walks alone at dusk? And that's when everything changes. Because suspicion feeds on visibility. And cats are visible. They move through streets freely. They enter homes uninvited. They appear in doorways at inconvenient times. If a town is already tense, the image of a woman and her cat becomes narrative glue, binding misfortune to a human story. And here's the unsettling part. Once suspicion attaches, evidence becomes secondary. Association becomes enough. Think about how public suspicion works today in digital spaces. An influencer is photographed standing next to a controversial figure. No proof of wrongdoing, just proximity. Screenshots circulate. Narratives form. Reputation shifts. The medieval town operated similarly, but through whispers rather than algorithms. A woman seen with a cat at night becomes a story waiting for misfortune to attach itself. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, legal documents from various European regions, including France, show increasing concern with maleficium, or harmful magic. Formal witchcraft trials would intensify later, especially after the publication of texts like the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487, outside much of our time frame but indicative of emerging thought. French legal culture during this period combined local customary law with expanding royal oversight. Under rulers like Charles VI and later Louis XI, the monarchy sought stronger central control, but local courts retained significant influence over daily disputes. Accusations involving animals and suspected harmful influence appear sporadically in records, though documentation linking specific women to cat-centered prosecutions remains limited and debated. Historians caution against projecting later witch hunt intensity backward onto the 14th century. Still, the cultural association was forming, and associations matter. A widow walks at dusk, a cat follows. A town under stress looks for explanation. Independence becomes suspicious. Symbolism fills the gaps. Cats and women become entwined in imagination, not always, not everywhere, but enough to matter. But suspicion alone does not create trials. It needs structure, paper, procedure, witnesses. In the next chapter, we step back into the courtroom, not to see panic, but to watch bureaucracy absorb fear. A gavel strikes wood. The room falls silent, not because truth has been revealed, but because the performance has begun. It's 1463. You're inside a municipal hall in eastern France. The stone walls hold the day's heat, but the air still feels cool. Wax candles drip slowly into iron holders. The faint smell of parchment and sweat lingers. The magistrate enters. Everyone stands. A clerk unrolls a scroll. Ink glistens where it has not fully dried. The language is formal, structured, precise. Charges are read. Witnesses step forward. The accused, an animal, cannot respond. And yet the ritual unfolds exactly as it would for a human defendant. Here's what most people miss. The courtroom is not just a room. It is a stage, raised platform, ordered seating, witnesses called in sequence, every movement choreographed. Because justice must be seen. Power doesn't whisper, it performs. By the 15th century, French legal systems had grown more organized. Royal authority expanded gradually after the instability of the 100 Years' War. Courts became more structured. Record-keeping improved. Municipal archives from Burgundy, Savoy, and surrounding regions preserved documentation of animal prosecutions in this period. The procedural elements are striking. Formal complaints, custody of the animals, scheduled hearings, sentencing. These were not spontaneous mob decisions. They were civic events. And here's where it gets complicated. The animal's presence in court transformed private fear into public affirmation, even if everyone knew the outcome, even if the animal could not comprehend proceedings. The ritual mattered, because ritual converts anxiety into structure. In a deeply hierarchical society, that structure mirrored divine order. The magistrate stands elevated. The accused is contained. The crowd observes. Heaven above, earth below, order restored. Now imagine a town strained by years of war taxes, or rumors of plague spreading through trade routes, or harvest fluctuating unpredictably. Tension hums beneath daily life. If something goes wrong, if harm occurs, and the court does nothing. Authority weakens, but if the court convenes, reads charges, announces judgment, stability feels tangible again. And this is where history shifts. The trial becomes less about the animal and more about the audience. Justice becomes theatre, and theatre reinforces belief, because once you watch order being performed, you are less likely to question its existence. Think about televised congressional hearings or corporate investigations streamed live. Sometimes the audience already suspects the conclusion, but the process matters. The seating arrangement, the formal language, the witnesses sworn in. Even when outcomes are predictable, the ritual reassures viewers that systems are functioning. Medieval courts operated under similar logic. Instead of cameras, there were bells summoning townspeople to gather. Instead of microphones, there were heralds projecting authority. But the emotional architecture was strikingly familiar. In the 15th century, local courts across France operated under a blend of customary law and expanding royal jurisdiction. Legal historians note that municipal archives in regions like Savoy and Burgundy contain records of animal trials conducted with procedural consistency. The 1386 Falaise case remains one of the clearest examples of formal sentencing, including documentation of execution expenses. Later cases, such as the 1522 Autumn Rat trial, demonstrate the persistence of procedural seriousness, even when the accused were animals. While direct records of cat-specific courtroom prosecutions are less abundant than those involving pigs, cats appear within broader patterns of symbolic prosecution and ritual punishment. Historians continue to debate scale and frequency, But the theatrical structure of medieval justice is not in dispute. A magistrate elevated, a clerk reading charges, an audience watching, an animal contained, justice enacted as ritual, fear converted into formality, because belief requires reinforcement, and reinforcement requires spectacle. We're halfway through this journey, and here's a question worth pausing on. When you see public justice today, whether online or in courtrooms, how much of it feels like resolution? And how much feels like reassurance? If this exploration is reshaping how you see history and power, consider supporting the channel so we can continue making deep, slow-burn documentaries like this. Now, we turn to something subtler, because not everyone in medieval Europe was convinced. Not everyone believed animals truly carried guilt. And doubt, when it appears inside a system built on certainty, is dangerous. We're halfway through this journey. And here's a question worth pausing on. When you see public justice today, whether online or in courtrooms, how much of it feels like resolution? And how much feels like reassurance? If this exploration is reshaping how you see history and power, consider supporting the channel so we can continue making deep, slow-burn documentaries like this. Now, we turn to something subtler, because not everyone in medieval Europe was convinced. Not everyone believed animals truly carried guilt. And doubt, when it appears inside a system built on certainty, is dangerous. In the next chapter, we explore skepticism. Clerics who hesitated, jurists who questioned, whispers inside the very institutions that staged the trials. Because when the system begins to doubt itself, everything trembles. A scholar pauses mid-sentence. Ink gathers at the tip of his quill. He hesitates. And for the first time, someone asks, can an animal truly be guilty? It's 1482. You're inside a university lecture hall in Paris. The stone walls are colder here than in municipal courts. The air smells of vellum and dust. Light slips through tall windows, illuminating rows of wooden benches. At the front stands a master of law. Students lean forward, cloaked in dark wool. He speaks about Roman legal principles, about intention, about culpability, about the difference between rational agency and brute action. A student raises a hand. If an animal lacks reason, he asks carefully, how can it commit a crime? The room shifts, not dramatically, just slightly. And here's what most people miss. By the late 15th century, Europe was changing intellectually. Universities had flourished since the 12th century. Legal thought was more systematized. Roman law texts were being studied closely. The idea of intention, mens rea, was gaining conceptual clarity, and intention requires reason, which animals, by definition, did not possess. So what exactly had earlier courts been punishing? Medieval Europe was not intellectually stagnant. Scholastic thinkers, drawing from Aristotle and Christian theology, debated the nature of the soul. Animals, according to dominant theological interpretation, possessed sensory souls, but not rational, immortal souls. Humans could sin. Animals could not sin in the same moral sense. And here's where it gets complicated. If animals couldn't sin, then why try them? Some jurists defended animal prosecutions as necessary for public order, not moral condemnation. The animal was dangerous. Removing it publicly restored safety and confidence. Others leaned on older customary traditions, but doubt was creeping in. Legal historians note that by the late 15th and early 16th centuries, skepticism, about the logic of animal trials increased among learned elites, not necessarily among the general population, but within intellectual circles. And when elite opinion shifts, institutions eventually follow. Now imagine the tension. On one side, tradition, custom, public reassurance. On the other, emerging rationalism, more refined legal theory, quiet skepticism. And that's when everything changes, because systems built on performance struggle when belief thins. If people begin to suspect that a trial is symbolic rather than necessary, the ritual loses gravity, the spectacle risks becoming absurd, and absurdity is dangerous for authority. Power doesn't whisper, it performs, but performance only works if the audience believes. Think about moments when public institutions lose credibility. A company stages an apology that feels rehearsed. A government inquiry seems performative. At first, the ritual calms people, but once audiences sense emptiness, trust erodes. Medieval animal trials relied on collective belief. Once belief weakened among intellectual leaders, the practice became harder to defend. Not overnight, but gradually. By the late 1400s, universities such as the University of Paris were major centers of legal and theological scholarship. Roman law concepts, preserved and expanded through medieval study, emphasized intention in determining culpability. While documented animal trials persisted into the early 16th century, like the 1522 autumn rat case, the tone in some legal commentary shifted toward irony or procedural curiosity rather than unquestioned acceptance. Historians debate whether popular belief declined at the same rate as elite skepticism. Evidence suggests rural communities often maintained older customs longer than urban intellectual circles. This divergence matters because law does not change all at once. It fractures along class and educational lines. A student questions culpability. A professor hesitates. Roman law emphasizes intention. Animals lack rational souls. The logic of prosecution begins to wobble, not in the streets, but in the lecture halls. And doubt, once introduced, spreads quietly. But just as skepticism grows, Europe faces catastrophe, plague, mass death, economic collapse, and when fear surges again, rational doubt can retreat, because in times of crisis, symbolism regains power. Next, we enter the 14th century's darkest chapter. The bells do not stop ringing. One funeral ends, another begins, and somewhere in the alley behind the church, a cat darts past a shuttered door. It's 1348. You're standing in a narrow street in southern France. The air smells wrong, sweet and sour at the same time. Smoke drifts from hurried fires meant to cleanse the air. Windows are closed, doors are marked. People avoid eye contact. The plague has arrived. The Black Death spreads along trade routes with terrifying speed. By 1351, it will claim millions across Europe. Estimates vary, but many historians place mortality between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population in some regions. You don't know about bacteria. You don't know about fleas carried by rats. You only know this: people are dying, fast, without clear explanation. And when explanation fails, imagination fills the void. Here's what most people miss. Crisis doesn't invent fear, it accelerates it. The pandemic that reached Europe in 1347 to 1348 devastated France. Cities like Marseille were early entry points. From there, the disease moved inland along river and trade networks. Medical theory at the time relied on humoral balance and miasma. The idea that corrupted air carried disease. People tried everything: bonfires to purify atmosphere, perfumed cloths over noses, processions of prayer. Some communities turned against minorities, falsely accusing Jewish populations of poisoning wells, leading to horrific violence in parts of Europe. And here's where it gets complicated. Modern popular myth sometimes claims that widespread killing of cats during the medieval period worsened plague spread by allowing rat populations to explode. Historians debate this heavily. Evidence does not clearly demonstrate coordinated, continent-wide cat exterminations prior to or during the Black Death. Cats continued to exist in medieval towns. However, localized hostility toward animals associated with darkness or misfortune may have intensified during moments of panic. And panic magnifies symbolism. Now imagine this street again. You've seen 3 funerals this week. Your neighbor's child is sick. You hear scratching in the walls at night. Rats. You see a cat slip through the alley at dusk. You remember sermons about hidden evil. You remember festival fires. You remember whispers about women and their animals. In times of relative stability, doubt grows. In times of terror, certainty hardens. And that's when everything changes. Because fear demands targets. Targets make chaos feel containable. Power doesn't whisper, it performs. And in moments of mass death, performance becomes urgent. Consider how modern societies respond to sudden crises. A pandemic emerges. Rumors spread faster than verified information. Certain groups, objects, or behaviors become scapegoats. People cling to symbolic acts, public sanitizing rituals, visible enforcement measures. Not always because they are scientifically effective, but because they reassure. Medieval Europe faced catastrophe without microbiology. Symbolic action filled that gap, not because people were irrational, but because uncertainty is unbearable. The Black Death reached Marseille in 1347 and spread rapidly through France in 1348 to 1350. Mortality estimates vary by region, but many urban centers lost significant portions of their populations. Contemporary chronicles describe processions, penitential movements, and extreme measures taken to ward off disease. Documentation directly linking organized cat persecutions to plague mitigation is limited and contested. Historians caution against repeating simplified narratives. However, broader patterns of scapegoating and symbolic purification during crisis are well documented. The psychological mechanism is clear, even if specific local practices vary. And in such an atmosphere, animals already symbolically charged could easily be folded into narratives of contamination. Plague arrives, death accelerates, explanation collapses, symbolism strengthens, fear seeks shape, and when fear finds shape, it often chooses something visible, something vulnerable, something already suspected. But crisis does not last forever. And as Europe slowly recovers, economically, demographically, psychologically, something unexpected happens. The bureaucracy grows stronger, records become more detailed, and blame becomes organized. Next, we step inside the machinery of accusation itself. A clerk sands a fresh page of parchment, blows gently, the ink dries, and with that small gesture, an accusation becomes permanent. It's 1492. You're inside a municipal chamber in eastern France. The plague years are decades behind you, but their memory lingers like a scar beneath clothing. The room is quieter than a festival square, more controlled, more procedural. A wooden table dominates the center. Ledgers are stacked neatly. Wax seals sit in shallow dishes. The smell of ink and animal hide parchment fills the air. SFX, scratching quill, low murmuring. A complaint is being recorded. A neighbor claims that livestock were found mutilated. Another claims a child was scratched and fell ill. A cat is mentioned. The clerk does not roll his eyes. He writes, because in this century, late 15th century France, writing is authority. What is written becomes actionable. What is archived becomes real. And here's what most people miss. Blame becomes more powerful when it becomes bureaucratic. After the devastation of the Black Death and the prolonged instability of the 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, French governance gradually centralized. Under rulers like Charles VII and later Louis XI, administrative reforms strengthened royal courts and fiscal systems. Record-keeping expanded. Municipal governments kept more detailed accounts of disputes, fines, punishments. And here's where it gets complicated. Once accusation enters a ledger, it gains weight. Even if evidence is thin, even if testimony is rumor, documentation creates gravity. In earlier centuries, fear may have lived in whispers. Now it lived in ink. Animal prosecutions, where they occurred, followed recognizable procedural steps. Complaint filed, animal detained witnesses called sentence issued. The structure was repetitive, predictable, stabilizing. Power doesn't whisper, it performs. But by the late 1400s, power also files paperwork. Now imagine how this changes social dynamics. If you suspect your neighbor, you can formalize it. If you fear a symbol, you can codify it. And that's when everything changes. Because bureaucracy does not reduce fear. It organizes it. It standardizes it. It gives it channels. If a cat becomes associated with harm, whether through livestock damage or symbolic suspicion, the court provides a mechanism, a script, a pathway from rumor to sentence. The spectacle may be less fiery than a midsummer bonfire, but it is more enduring. Because paper lasts. Think of how modern systems log complaints, customer service tickets, police reports, digital moderation flags. The moment something enters a database, it becomes quantifiable. It becomes trackable. It feels validated. Medieval bureaucracy was slower, handwritten, fragile, but psychologically similar. An accusation written down feels heavier than one spoken aloud. And once multiple accusations accumulate, a pattern appears, even if that pattern is constructed from anxiety. The late 15th century saw expanded royal authority in France, following the end of the 100 Years' War in 1453. Municipal archives from regions including Burgundy and Savoy preserve legal documentation of disputes involving animals, including prosecutions for property damage and injury. Direct cat-specific trial records remain rarer than pig prosecutions, but cats appear in broader contexts of nuisance, suspicion, and symbolic ritual. Historians caution against assuming uniform practice across France. Legal customs varied regionally. Rural courts operated differently from urban centers. But one trend is clear. As record-keeping intensified, legal culture became more procedural, less spontaneous, more archival. And archives preserve both justice and fear. Ink dries. Complaints become cases. Fear becomes formatted. The court system absorbs anxiety and redistributes it as procedure. Less fire, more parchment. but the symbolic logic remains intact, because systems survive by adapting their performances. Yet something else is happening beneath the surface. Crowds still gather, whispers still circulate, and spectacle still matters. In the next chapter, we step away from parchment and into the psychology of the crowd itself. The verdict is announced. For half a second, there is silence. Then the crowd exhales. Together. It's 1498. You're standing in a provincial town square in eastern France at dusk. The sky is violet, fading toward night. Torches flicker against stone walls. The air smells of smoke and trampled grass. A wooden platform has been erected. People press inward, shoulder to shoulder. You feel warmth from bodies on either side. A child cranes upward to see. An older man mutters approval before anything has even happened. At the center of attention, contained, restrained, is the animal accused. The magistrate speaks loudly. The crowd does not fully understand every legal phrase, but they understand tone. They understand certainty. They understand finality. And here's what most people miss. The trial may have begun in parchment and ink, but its power is completed in the crowd. Medieval towns were tightly interwoven social ecosystems. Everyone knew each other's business. Privacy was rare. Reputation was currency. When a public trial occurred, whether of a human or an animal, it was not merely judicial. It was communal therapy. Fear is destabilizing when private. It becomes stabilizing when shared. And here's where it gets complicated. Crowds amplify emotion. If one person expresses relief, others follow. If one person shouts condemnation, others feel safer doing the same. In the late medieval period, festivals, punishments, and civic rituals functioned as emotional regulators. They synchronized people. They aligned them. They reminded them who belonged and what did not. Power doesn't whisper. It performs. But the crowd is the amplifier. Without witnesses, spectacle loses force. Now imagine the psychological shift. Before the verdict, tension. After the verdict, release. The animal, symbolic vessel of fear, is removed. The town exhales. Order feels restored. And that's when everything changes, because relief reinforces belief. If you feel calmer after the spectacle, you are more likely to support it next time. The system becomes self-validating, even if the original fear was misdirected. And here's the unsettling part. The crowd does not need cruelty to function. It needs coherence. The execution, exile, or destruction of a symbol provides that coherence. Consider modern viral outrage cycles. A controversy builds online, emotion escalates, then a public apology, firing, or ban occurs. Suddenly, the digital crowd relaxes. Resolution may be partial or symbolic, but the emotional release is real. Medieval, crowds operated without screens, but the psychology was similar. Shared tension, public climax, collective relief. The mechanism is timeless. Late 15th century France was emerging from the 100 Years' War into a more centralized monarchy, yet local communities retained strong civic identities. Public punishments were common and visible. Executions for human crimes were often staged in town squares. Animal executions were recorded, followed similar public formats. Chroniclers from later centuries describe midsummer cat burnings in places like Paris's Place de Grève. Historians debate the frequency and exact details, but the broader practice of public ritual punishment is well documented across medieval Europe. Crowd presence was not incidental, it was integral. Justice required witnesses, because witnessing transformed punishment into social memory. Tension builds, verdict falls, relief spreads, belief strengthens. Spectacle completes the ritual, because authority is not only declared, it is felt. But by the end of the 15th century, Europe is shifting again. Printing presses hum. Humanist scholars question inherited assumptions. And slowly, the old symbolic language begins to lose its grip. In the next chapter, we explore the turning point, when the trials start to fade. A new machine hums softly. Metal presses into ink. Ink presses into paper. And ideas begin to travel faster than fear. It's 1505. You're standing inside a modest print workshop in Lyon. The room smells of oil, hot metal, and fresh paper. Sheets hang from lines to dry. A press creaks rhythmically as workers ink type and lower the platen with practiced precision. Outside, the town moves as it always has. But inside this room, something subtle is happening. Text is multiplying. Legal treatises, theological debates, classical philosophy rediscovered. Humanist scholars, looking back to Roman sources, are asking sharper questions about law, intention, evidence. And here's what most people miss. Belief doesn't disappear suddenly. It thins. It shifts shape. It becomes harder to defend publicly. The late 15th and early 16th centuries marked the rise of Renaissance humanism in parts of Europe, including France. Scholars emphasized returning ad fonte to original sources, particularly Roman law and classical philosophy. Roman jurisprudence, carefully studied, placed increasing emphasis on rational agency and intention. Animals, by definition, lacked that rational capacity. And here's where it gets complicated. This did not mean medieval people suddenly realized animals couldn't be guilty. Many always knew animals lacked moral souls. But the symbolic utility of trying them began to look archaic, especially to educated elites. As legal systems professionalized, efficiency mattered more. Centralized monarchies preferred uniform codes over localized ritual. Spectacle began to yield to administration. Power doesn't whisper, it performs. But performance can evolve. By the early 1500s, performance increasingly meant paperwork, taxation, standing armies, not bonfires and animal defendants. Now imagine a magistrate in 1510 confronted with a complaint about an animal. He could convene a public spectacle, or he could quietly order the animal destroyed and fine the owner. One is dramatic, the other is efficient. And that's when everything changes. Because once authority becomes confident enough not to perform symbolically, it shifts toward pragmatism. Animal trials did not vanish overnight. The 1522 autumn rat case shows the tradition still alive, but the tone begins to change. Some proceedings feel procedural curiosity, almost theatrical in a self-aware way, less existential. Think about how certain public rituals fade in modern institutions. Public stocks and pillories once displayed criminals in town squares. Today, punishment is processed behind institutional walls. We still prosecute wrongdoing, but spectacle has moved or diminished. Similarly, as legal rationalism grew in early modern Europe, the symbolic prosecution of animals began to look unnecessary, not immoral, just outdated. The emotional need it once fulfilled was being met elsewhere, through stronger centralized states and more predictable governance, more administrative. By the early 16th century, France was entering the Renaissance under rulers like Francis I of France, who patronized humanist scholarship and centralized royal authority. Printing presses had spread widely across French cities by 1500, accelerating the circulation of legal and theological thought. Animal trials did not disappear instantly, but documented cases become rarer as the centuries progress. Historians caution against drawing a clean line between medieval superstition and modern rationality. Belief systems overlap. Practices fade unevenly across regions, but the trajectory is visible. Symbolic prosecution gradually declines, not because people become kinder overnight, but because the system evolves. Printing spreads ideas, legal theory sharpens, central authority strengthens, public spectacle loses some necessity, animal trials persist briefly, then thin, then fade. Belief transforms, performance adapts. But something curious happens next. As the practice fades, the stories grow. Chroniclers exaggerate. Enlightenment thinkers mock. The medieval cat trial becomes legend. In the next chapter, we separate myth from record. A writer dips his pen in ink. 300 years later, he smiles slightly as he describes a medieval crowd burning cats, not as documentation, but as evidence of backwardness. It's 1750. You're no longer in medieval France. You're in an Enlightenment-era study in Paris. Tall windows, polished wooden desk, shelves of books, classical philosophy, scientific treatises, satire. Candles burn cleanly. The air smells faintly of wax and ink, not smoke and livestock. A writer drafts an essay criticizing the superstitions of earlier centuries. He references stories of animal trials, of cat burnings, of absurd legal proceedings against rats. He shakes his head. For him, these are not complex rituals of social order. They are proof of ignorance. And here's what most people miss. History is not just what happened. It is how later generations choose to remember it. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European intellectual culture had shifted dramatically. Scientific inquiry expanded. Legal systems modernized further. Secular philosophy gained influence. To elevate their own era, Enlightenment thinkers often contrasted themselves against what they labeled the Dark Ages. Animal trials became convenient examples. A cat in a courtroom, rats assigned lawyers, perfect satire. But here's where it gets complicated. Many Enlightenment writers relied on selective anecdotes. Some accounts were accurate but rare. Others were repeated without context. Still others were exaggerated over time. The result? A flattened narrative. Medieval people became caricatures, irrational, cruel, absurd. What disappeared was the psychological logic, the systemic structure, the symbolic coherence. And once nuance vanishes, ridicule replaces understanding. Power doesn't whisper, it performs. But memory performs too, and sometimes it performs superiority. Now consider the stakes. If you believe the past was ridiculous, you assume you are immune. If you think medieval people were uniquely irrational, you stop examining your own symbolic rituals. And that's when everything changes. Because myth simplifies, reality complicates. Yes, animals were tried in medieval Europe. Yes, some festivals appear to have involved cats in disturbing symbolic roles. But historians debate frequency, scale, and interpretation. Surviving documentation is fragmentary. Regional variation was significant. There was no continent-wide campaign against cats. There was no universal belief in feline criminality. There were local practices, local fears, local performances of order, and those matter. Think about how future generations might interpret our era. Will viral outrage cycles look rational or absurd? Will public shaming online appear enlightened or theatrical? When historians examine screenshots of digital mobs demanding symbolic punishment, will they see moral clarity or ritualized reassurance? The medieval cat trial may not be as distant from us as we imagine. The medium changes, the psychology persists. Descriptions of cat burnings in Paris, particularly at the Place de Grève, appear prominently in later accounts, some written centuries after the supposed events. Historians continue to debate how literal, frequent, or symbolic these descriptions were. Well-documented animal trials, such as the 1386 Falaise sow case and the 1522 Artum rat case, confirm that legal proceedings against animals did occur, but they were not daily events, nor were they universally endorsed. The archival record reveals irregularity, not constant mania, and that nuance is essential. The practice fades, the stories grow, Enlightenment writers mock. The Middle Ages become a cautionary tale. Complex systems shrink into punchlines. But history is rarely that simple. So, after 5 hours, after firelight and parchment, plague and performance, we arrive at the final question. Why did this make sense? And what does that reveal? Not about them, but about us. The courtroom is empty now. The bonfires are cold. The ledgers are closed. But the question remains, how could this ever have felt reasonable? It's late at night, not medieval France, your room. The glow of a screen reflects softly against the wall. Outside, the world feels uncertain in its own ways. Economic shifts, political tension, algorithmic outrage cycles. Now imagine stepping back into 14th century France. No germ theory, no centralized police force, no modern media, just a tightly woven town, a church bell, a magistrate, a cat crossing the threshold between candlelight and shadow. You hear scratching in the walls. You see a child fall ill. You remember sermons about hidden corruption. You remember festivals that promise purification. You believe deeply that the universe is ordered. If disorder appears, it must be addressed, publicly, visibly. And here's what most people miss. The trial was not about the cat. It was about coherence. Between 1100 and 1500, medieval France operated within a worldview structured by divine hierarchy. Every level of existence had meaning. Every disruption required interpretation. When animals harmed humans, legal systems extended procedure to contain anxiety. When symbolism attached to cats, through heresy fears, nighttime ambiguity, gendered suspicion, it made them vulnerable in moments of crisis. When plague struck, fear intensified. When bureaucracy matured, accusation formalized. When crowds gathered, belief synchronized. None of this required stupidity. It required stress. It required uncertainty. It required a system that equated visible justice with restored balance. Power doesn't whisper, it performs. And medieval power performed stability in the only language available to it, ritual. Now consider something unsettling. We still do this, not with cats, but with symbols. We identify threats, sometimes real, sometimes exaggerated. We demand public accountability. We gather, physically or digitally, to witness resolution. We feel relief when the ritual concludes, and that's when everything changes. Because once we recognize the pattern, the Middle Ages stop feeling distant. They feel human. Think of modern corporate scandals. A company makes a mistake. The public demands action. An executive resigns publicly. Statements are issued. the system performs correction. Sometimes real reform follows. Sometimes the ritual itself satisfies enough people that deeper problems remain untouched. Medieval animal trials operated within a similar emotional framework. They were reassurance mechanisms, visible proofs that disorder had been addressed. The tools were different. The psychology was not. We have documented evidence of animal prosecutions in late medieval France, including the 1386 Falaise sow execution and the 1522 autumn rat trial. We have references, some debated, of cats used symbolically in festival rituals. We have the 1233 papal bull vox in Rama, contributing to imagery linking black cats with heresy in polemical contexts. We have expanding legal bureaucracies under monarchs like Louis XI and later Renaissance rulers, gradually professionalizing courts. And we have historians who caution against exaggeration, reminding us that surviving records are uneven, regionally specific, and sometimes filtered through later moral agendas. The truth sits in that complexity, not in caricature. Cats were useful, then symbolic, then vulnerable. Trials were structured, festivals were ritualized, crowds synchronized belief, bureaucracy formalized fear, intellectual shifts thinned the practice, memory exaggerated it, and through it all, society sought coherence. So what do we do with this story? We resist the temptation to laugh. We resist the temptation to sneer at superstition. Instead, we ask a harder question. Where do we perform reassurance today? What symbols do we elevate or condemn when we feel uncertainty? What rituals make us feel safe? Because history is not a mirror for superiority. It is a mirror for recognition. Power doesn't whisper, it performs. And sometimes it performs through the smallest, most ordinary creature slipping through shadow. Thank you for staying through this 5-hour journey into one of medieval Europe's strangest and most revealing rituals. If this exploration shifted how you see the past, consider liking and subscribing. It helps us continue producing deep, long-form historical documentaries that treat complexity with care. Next time, we'll step into another overlooked corner of history, where law, fear, and spectacle intersect in ways that feel uncomfortably familiar. Until then, look closely at the rituals around you. They may be telling you more than you think.